The house was filled with the quiet hum of everyday life. The ticking of the kitchen wall clock seemed louder than usual, echoing faintly against the weathered cabinets. And Harlow stood by the sink with her auburn hair in a loose knot and a fine sheen of sweat on her brow. The faucet had been dripping all morning, and after weeks of ignoring it, she had decided to fix it herself. Her small toolbox lay open on the counter, containing a mismatched collection of wrenches and screwdrivers. She inherited from her late husband, and sighed and knelt to peer beneath the sink. Her knees creaked as she shifted, twisting the wrench more forcefully than necessary. The pipe groaned in protest, and before she could react, her arm slipped into the confined space, wedged between two rusted fixtures. "Damn it, Ed," she pulls back instinctively, only to discover her arm is stuck. Panic flared briefly as she tugged harder, the pipe's edges digging into her skin. The pain was sharp but manageable, but the helplessness of the situation made her stomach twist. She leaned back awkwardly, attempting to move herself into a better position, but the movement only seemed to exacerbate her situation, and closed her eyes and exhaled deeply to steady herself. She whispered, "Just think." Her phone was on the counter, just out of reach. She could see the screen glow faintly, with a message notification blinking. She cursed her stubbornness for attempting to repair herself. It wasn't just about saving money. It was about proving her ability. Handle things on her own. She'd spent the last year regaining her independence. After losing her husband brick by brick, she was trapped and vulnerable in the quiet kitchen, feeling an unsettling combination of frustration and embarrassment. The sound of the front door creaking open startled her. Anne's heart rate increased, and she froze for a brief moment, her thoughts racing. Who would enter her home unannounced? The soft thud of footsteps followed, hesitant but deliberate as they moved through the hall. Anne craned her neck to see the intruder, her pulse quickening, and heard a deep and familiar voice call out, and relief washed over her as she recognized it. John Larson was the son of her late husband's best friend, a thoughtful young man in his early 20s. He had been a consistent presence in her life since the funeral, assisting with minor tasks and occasionally checking in on her, and had always appreciated his kindness, but she had not expected him to be present today. She called, her voice full of relief. John appeared in the doorway moments later, his tall frame filling the narrow space. His hazel eyes widened slightly as he saw, and crouched awkwardly by the sink, her arm trapped beneath the fixture. "What happened?" There was a faint sheen of panic on her face. He inquired, stepping closer, concern etched on his features. "I got stuck trying to fix that stupid pipe," and admitted that she didn't think it would be this complicated. John knelt beside her, his movements careful and deliberate. "Letting me take a look," he said, his voice calm and reassuring as he reached out his fingers, brushing against hers as he examined the pipe. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through and that she hadn't anticipated. "It's pretty tight," John murmured, frowning slightly. "I'm going to try loosening it." "Hold still." Magenta's hands remained steady, and his focus was intense as he twisted the wrench. She couldn't help but notice his brow furrowing in concentration, or the faint scent of cologne that lingered in the air between them. It was a strange, unexpected, and disarming intimacy. John explained that after a few tense minutes, the pipe released with a metallic groan, and Anne's arm slipped free. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and flexed her fingers experimentally. "Thank you," she said, her voice softening. "I don't know what I would have done without you." John smiled a boyish grin that momentarily broke the tension. "I'm glad I could help," he said, "but maybe next time call me before you start playing plumber." And laughed, a sound that felt almost foreign after weeks of solitude. John stood, offering her a hand to help her up, and hesitated briefly before taking it. Her palm pressed against his, and the warmth of his touch lingered long after she let go. A small detail that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "Are you okay?" John asked, his tone changing back to one of genuine concern. His gaze landed on hers, and sensed an unspoken question in the air between them. "I'm fine," she replied, brushing her hands against her jeans, embarrassed. "There is no need to be," John said gently. "Everyone needs help sometimes," and nodded, but the words struck a deep chord with her. She'd spent so long proving she didn't need anyone, that she could handle everything on her own. But now, with John standing in her kitchen, his presence steady and grounding, she couldn't deny the comfort of having someone to lean on as John moved to clean up the scattered red tools, and found herself observing him. Her thoughts swirled with gratitude and something she couldn't quite name. The vulnerability of the moment, the quiet intimacy of their interaction. It left her feeling exposed in unexpected ways, and hardly noticed the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, which marked the passage of time. The morning had taken an unexpected turn, and as she stood in the quiet kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the start of something much more complicated, and couldn't figure out why the kitchen felt different now. Perhaps it was the faint echo of vulnerability still in the air, or the way the morning sunlight shone brighter, illuminating every corner of the room as if it were revealing secrets. She stood by the sink, staring blankly at her arm, where faint red marks from the pipe remained. This light sting reminded her of the previous chaos, but it wasn't the pain in her arm that worried her. It was John. He was still there, kneeling beside the cabinet, carefully sorting the tools back. His movements were deliberate, his focus unwavering, but he exuded a calm energy that filled the space between them, and couldn't help but stare at him, lingering longer than she intended. She told herself it was gratitude, that she was just grateful for his assistance, but a part of her knew there was more to it. "You're lucky it didn't get worse." John spoke, breaking the silence, his voice calm and steady, but with a hint of something else beneath it, concern, perhaps, or frustration, and blinked, jolting herself out of her thoughts. "I know," she said, "I should have just called someone." And John agreed, looking up at her with a faint smile. "You should have." His tone was playful, but his hazel eyes radiated warmth that made Anne's chest tighten. She forced a laugh, brushing her hands against her jeans as if trying to shake off the stress of the situation. "Well, now I know better," she said, her voice lighter than her mood. John finished packing the toolbox and stood up, his tall frame making the small kitchen appear even smaller. He held the box in one hand and rested the other casually on his hip. "Where do you want it?" he asked, gesturing toward the toolbox, and replied, "Just leave it on the counter," motioning vaguely. "I'll put it away later." John nodded, setting the box down with a soft thud. He lingered by the counter for a moment, his gaze drifting around the room before settling back on her. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his tone softer now, and hesitated, her breath catching as she met his gaze. There was something disarming about the way he looked at her, steady and unwavering, as though he could see past the walls she had spent years building. It made her feel exposed, vulnerable in a way she wasn't used to. "I'm fine," she said finally, her voice firm but not too convincing. John tilted his head slightly and felt her pulse stop full. "You don't have to tend to me, you know," he said. "It's okay to admit when you need help." The word struck a chord deep within her, and looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of the sink as she tried to steady herself. "Appreciate that," she said quietly, "but I'm used to handling things on my own." "You don't have to, though," John said, stepping closer. His voice was still calm, but there was an intensity to it now, a quiet insistence that made her chest ache. "You don't always have to do everything alone." Anne's eyes flicked back to him, her green gaze meeting his hazel one. She wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't understand, but the sincerity in his expression made the words catch in her throat. Instead, she nodded, her lips curving into a faint, reluctant smile. "And she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John smiled in return, a small boyish grin that made the tension in the room feel a little less heavy. Anytime he said simply, the moment lingered, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. And felt her pulse, quicken her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. Gratitude, relief, something warmer, something heavy. It was all there, tangled together in a way that left her feeling unsteady. John cleared his throat, stepping back slightly as though sensing her discomfort. "I should probably get going," he said, his tone casual but his eyes still searching hers of course, and said quickly, her voice tinged with nervousness, "I'm sure you have things to do, yeah." John said, Though he didn't sound entirely convinced, he lingered for a moment longer before nodding. "But if you need anything, anything at all, you know where to find me." And nodded, her throat tight, as she watched him turn and head toward the door. She followed him to the front hall, her footsteps slow and measured. When he reached the door, he paused, glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Take care of yourself," and he said softly. "I will," she replied, her voice barely audible. And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where he had been. The house felt impossibly quiet now, the stillness pressing down on her like a weight. She turned back toward the kitchen, her steps heavy as she tried to shake off the lingering sense of unease. But as she stood by the sink, staring out the window at the sunlit yard, she couldn't ignore the way her heart raced or the thoughts that kept circling in her mind. John's words, his touch, the way he had looked at her, it all felt significant in a way she couldn't quite explain. And exhaled deeply, her hands trembling as she pressed them to the counter. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that something had shifted and there was no going back. The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting soft, fragmented beams across the living room floor. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant chirping of birds outside. And sat on the sofa, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. She had been staring at the same page of her book for nearly 20 minutes, her eyes skimming over the words without absorbing a single one. Her mind was elsewhere. Specifically, it was on John. Ever since he had left that morning, his words and the quiet strength of his presence lingered with her. There was something disarming about him, something that unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite put into words. She told herself it was nothing, just gratitude for his help, but deep down she knew it was more. The sound of the front door opening startled her, pulling her out of her thoughts, and tensed, setting her tea down on the coffee table as her heart quickened. She wasn't expecting anyone for a brief moment. Panic flared in irrational fear that something was wrong. But then she heard John's voice, warm and familiar, calling out from the hallway. "It's just me," he said, his tone casual, and exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She stood brushing her hands against her jeans as she moved toward the doorway. "John," she called, "what are you doing here?" He appeared in the entryway, a faint smile on his lips. He held up a small plastic bag. "I left this in the kitchen," he said. "I figured I would drop it off," and frowned and moved closer. The bag contained a jar of honey, which she vaguely remembered setting aside while they were cleaning up. She couldn't help smiling at his thoughtfulness. "You did not have to do this." That is what she said as she took the bag from him. "I was in the neighborhood," he said with a shrug, but the way he looked at her suggested otherwise, and replied softly, "Thank you." She gestured toward the living room. "Do you want to sit for a while? I'll just made tea." John hesitated briefly before nodding. "Sure," he replied. "I could use a break." They moved into the living room, the air between them carrying a quiet tension that neither appeared willing to acknowledge, and poured him a cup of tea, her movements precise and deliberate, as if this simple task required her complete concentration. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed briefly, causing her pulse to race. Quicken, they sat across from each other, the coffee table serving as both a necessary and suffocating barrier. For a while, they sipped their tea quietly, the weight of unspoken thoughts filling the room, and could feel John's eyes on her, steady and searching, and it made her chest tight. "You appear distracted," he said, finally breaking the silence, and raised her green eyes to meet his. She excused herself as being tired, feeling hollow as she did so. John nodded with a thoughtful expression. "You've gone through a lot," he said gently. "It's okay to be overwhelmed." The sincerity in his tone caught her off guard, and she felt a lump form in her throat. She averted her gaze, focusing on her hands as she struggled to maintain her balance. "I am fine," she said, her voice firmer now. "Really, you don't have to be," John said, his tone soft but insistent. "Not with me," Anne's breath hitched at his words, and she felt a wave of emotions rise within her. Gratitude, vulnerability, and something warmer, something more dangerous. She looked back at him, her chest tightening as she saw the concern in his hazel eyes. "Well, are you so kind to me?" she asked, her voice barely above in a whisper. John hesitated, his gaze dropping to his tea for a moment before returning to her. "Because you deserve it," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Anne's throat tightened, and she blinked back the tears that threatened to fall. She hadn't felt this seen, this understood, in years. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice trembling for everything. John smiled, a small, genuine smile that made her chest ache. Anytime they lapsed into silence again, but this time it felt different. The tension was still there, but it was accompanied by a quiet understanding, a shared moment that neither of them wanted to end. And found herself studying him, noticing details she hadn't before. The faint stubble on his jaw, the way his hair fell slightly over his forehead, the way his eyes seemed to hold both wisdom and vulnerability. "You've grown up so much," she said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. John chuckled, a low, warm sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "I guess I have," he said, "but you're still the same strong, stubborn, incredible." Anne's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, her heart pounding. She felt a strange mix of embarrassment and something warmer, something she didn't dare name. "You give me too much credit," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't think I do," John replied, his tone earnest. "You don't see yourself the way I do." The word struck her like a bolt of lightning, leaving her breathless. She looked up at him, her green eyes wide, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. The air between them was electric, charged with emotions they couldn't ignore. Anne's mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts and fears and possibilities. She wanted to say something to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat frozen, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of the moment. And then John spoke, his voice soft but steady. "And," he said her name, carrying a weight that made her chest ache. "I mean it, you're amazing, and I just think you should know that." Anne's breath caught, and she felt a single tear slip down her. She reached up and wiped it away, her hands trembling to bling. "You don't know how much that means to me," she said, her voice breaking. "I think I do," John said, his gaze unwavering. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a silence filled with possibility and didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing for certain. Everything had changed. The house was cloaked in the deep stillness that only comes with nightfall, the kind of quiet that seemed to amplify every sound. Outside, a faint breeze rustled through the trees, brushing their shadows against the windows like whispers of an unseen presence. Inside, the air was heavy, charged with an intensity that neither Anne nor John dared to address directly. And sat in the corner of the living room, a book lying unopened in her lap, the words on the cover blurred as her thoughts raced, far too loud to focus on anything else. The dim light of the table lamp cast soft golden hues across the room, but the warmth of the glow did little to ease the chill that had settled deep within her. She could hear John moving in the kitchen, the occasional clink of a glass, or the sound of water running in the sink. His presence was a comfort and a challenge, a reminder of everything that had been left unsaid between them. When he finally entered the living room, the soft creak of the floorboards under his feet made her heart leap and looked up, her green eyes meeting his hazel ones. And in that moment the room seemed to shrink around them. John hesitated in the doorway, his tall frame illuminated by the light spilling from the kitchen behind him. He looked unsure, almost vulnerable, as though he was trying to decide whether to step forward or retreat. "Can I sit?" he asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant, and nodded, her throat tightening. She gestured to the armchair across from her, and John moved toward it, lowering himself into the seat with a careful deliberation that made her chest ache. The coffee table between them felt like a fragile barrier, holding back the weight of everything they were avoiding for a moment. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched thick and oppressive, as though the house itself was waiting for one of them to break it. Anne's hand tightened around the edges of her book, her knuckles turning white as she struggled to find her voice. "John," she began, her tone wavering, "we need to talk." His gaze sharpened, the hesitation in his expression replaced by something more focused. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know," he said simply. Anne's chest tightened further at the simplicity of his response. She set the book aside, her hands trembling as she clasped them together in her lap. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let me," John said, his tone steady but not forceful. His hazel eyes locked onto hers, unwavering, as though he was searching for something in her expression. "I've been holding back because I didn't want to make things harder for you, but I can't keep pretending that I don't feel what I feel." Anne's breath hitched, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild animal trying to escape. She looked away, her gaze falling to the coffee table as she tried to steady herself. "John, this is complicated," she said, her voice trembling. "There's so much we haven't considered that I've considered everything," John replied, his voice firmer now. "I've thought about it every day, every moment I'm around you. And I know, it's not simple, but that doesn't make it any less real." And close her eyes, her chest aching with the weight of his words. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was she felt it too, the connection between them, the pull that seemed to draw them closer with every interaction. It was undeniable, no matter how much she tried to ignore it. "Well, now," she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I can't keep it inside anymore," John said, his tone softening. "I can't sit here and act like everything is normal when it's not for me." And looked up at him, her green eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I've spent so long trying to rebuild my life to prove that I can do this on my own, and now you don't have to." John interrupted gently. He leaned in even further, his hands resting on the edge of the coffee table. "And you don't need to go through this alone. Whatever it is, whatever happens, I am here for you." His words hung in the air, full of meaning, and felt a tear slide down her cheek. She reached up to wipe it away, her hands trembling. "I am scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of what this means and what it might do to us." Anne's heart ached at the vulnerability in John's tone, the raw honesty in his expression, and the sincerity in his hazel eyes, the same eyes that had always looked at her with kindness, understanding, and now with something more. John's voice was quiet and intense, but "I'd rather face that fear than spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been. I don't know if I can do this," she said. She wanted to believe him, to believe in the possibility of something good, something genuine, but her fear of the unknown, of what they might lose, held her back. "We need time," she said, her tone firmer. "We need to take this slowly to figure out what it is." John nodded, his expression softening. "I'll follow your lead," he said quietly. "Whatever you need. And I'm here." The sincerity in his voice and the quiet determination in his eyes made her chest tighten. She extended her fingers and brushed against his hand in a tentative gesture of trust. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop, the space between them charged with unspoken emotions as the clock on the mantel chimed softly to mark the hour, and realized that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, full of challenges and decisions they couldn't predict, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, flickering light in the dark. The night was unusually quiet, as if every creak of the house and every breath taken within its walls could be heard. And sat alone in the living room, the soft light from the lamp casting long shadows across the room. The book she'd tried to read earlier lay forgotten on the coffee table, its pages splayed open like an unanswered question. She stared at the darkened window, her reflection faint against the glass. And for the first time in years, she felt completely exposed, not to the outside world, but to herself. Her thoughts were a tangled web, with each strand leading back to John. His words from their last conversation echoed in her mind, their honesty and vulnerability breaking through the barriers she had built over the years. She had always taken pride in her independence, her ability to face life's challenges on her own. But now she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about strength and solitude. The faint sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted her reverie. Anne's heartbeat quickened, and her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't ready to face him. Not tonight. Not when her emotions were so raw. But there was no getting around it. John's presence in the house was undeniable, and she knew they couldn't continue to avoid the tension between them. My footsteps became louder and more liberated, eventually coming to a halt just outside the living room, and turned her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the doorway. John appeared moments later, his tall frame silhouetted against the hallway's dim lighting. He paused for a moment, his hazel eyes searching hers as if for permission to enter. "Couldn't sleep," he said softly, his voice low but steady, and shook her head, her lips curving into a thin, humorless smile. "Seems to be a theme lately," she replied. John stepped into the room, his movements careful and almost tentative. He didn't sit right away, instead standing near the armchair, as if waiting for her to invite him deeper into her space. The air between them was thick with unspoken words and emotions neither of them knew how to express. "Would you like to talk about it?" John inquired, his tone gentle yet insistent, and averted her gaze, focusing on her hands, which were tightly clenched in her lap. "I'm not sure if talking will help," she admitted. John said, his voice tinged with quiet conviction, as he lowered himself into the armchair across from her, leaning forward slightly with his elbows resting on his knees. "But we can't avoid this anymore, Anne." Her chest tightened at his words, a mix of fear and relief washing over her. She had spent so long running from her emotions, convincing herself that denying them was the safest option, but John's constant presence, his unwavering patience, made it impossible. "You don't understand why I keep running," she finally said, her voice trembling. "You have no idea what it's like to be this scared, to feel like everything you've built could crumble in an instant." John's hazel eyes softened, and he reached out his hand, resting lightly on the edge of the coffee table between them. "Then let me understand," he said. "Let me in, and I'm here because I want to be, because I care about you, but I need you to let me." Her breath hitched, her chest aching with the weight of his words. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the quiet strength in his expression, the same strength that had drawn her to him in ways she hadn't dared to acknowledge. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above in a whisper. "I don't know how to let someone in." John's gaze didn't waver. His expression was steady and reassuring. "You don't have to know," he said. "We'll figure it out together, but you don't have to do it alone." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet determination in his eyes, made her throat tighten. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she reached up to wipe it away, her hand trembling. "You make it sound so simple," she said, her voice breaking. "It's not OT simple," John said, his tone firm but gentle. "But it's worth it." Anne's chest ached with a mixture of fear and longing coursing through her. She wanted to believe him, to trust in the possibility of something good, something real, but the walls she had built around herself were high, and letting them crumble felt like an impossible task. "I'm scared," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what this means, of what it could do to us." John nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm scared too," he said, but it was fragile and tentative, but it was there, and it caused her chest to tighten in a painful yet exhilarating way. For a brief moment, they sat silently, the weight of their conversation settling around them like a quiet storm, and looked at John, her green eyes searching for answers she wasn't sure she was ready to find. And yet in his steady gaze, she felt a sense of reassurance, a quiet strength that made her want to believe. "I don't know where this will lead," she said finally, her voice soft but steady, "but I don't want to run from it anymore." John's lips curved into a faint smile, his relief evident in the way his shoulders relaxed. "That's all I needed to hear," he said, and exhaled deeply, a weight lifting from her chest, even as new questions formed in her mind. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and risks they couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of possibility. A flicker of light in the darkness, the early morning sunlight crept through the curtains, illuminating the room with a soft golden hue that seemed almost otherworldly, and sat on the edge of the sofa, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her mug, the tea inside long forgotten. Her reflection in the window, faint and ethereal, mirrored the conflicting emotions storming within her. The house was quiet save for the faint creak of old wood and the distant hum of birdsong. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was electric, charged with all the things left unsaid. She had spent the entire night turning over their conversation, replaying every word, every glance. The weight of John's sincerity lingered, wrapping around her like an invisible tether. There was no escaping the truth. Something had shifted between them. It was undeniable, like a current pulling them both toward uncharted waters, and that terrified her. The sound of footsteps descending the stairs broke through her thoughts, sharp and deliberate, and froze, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected him to come down so early. She hadn't prepared herself for this moment. The footsteps grew closer, each one sending ripples through her chest until John appeared in the doorway. He was barefoot, his dark hair tousled from sleep, wearing only a fitted t-shirt and sweatpants that hung low on his hips. The soft morning light caught the sharp angles of his jaw, the relaxed strength in his frame. He looked impossibly casual, yet somehow entirely deliberate, his presence filling the room like a quiet storm. Couldn't sleep either, huh? His voice was low, slightly hoarse, and it sent a shiver through her that she hoped he didn't notice, and cleared her throat, gripping the mug tighter as if it could anchor her. "Not really," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "Too much on my mind." "The same," John replied, stepping into the room. He leaned casually against the doorway. Crossing his arms over his chest, he unintentionally drew her attention to the subtle flecks of muscle beneath his shirt. She quickly averted her gaze, her cheeks warming. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with the same quiet intensity that always seemed to unravel her. "You've been awake all night," he observed, and forced a small smile, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "What would that have solved?" she asked, her tone light but tinged with something deeper. John's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained serious. "Maybe nothing," he admitted, "but you wouldn't have been alone." The sincerity in his voice struck her as soft but firm, and it made her chest tighten. She looked away, her gaze dropping to the mug in her hands. He took a step closer, then moved slowly and deliberately, and felt her pulse. She caught her breath as he crossed the invisible line she hadn't realized she'd drawn. He stopped just a foot away, his presence overwhelming in the small space. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, the faint scent of cedar, and something unmistakable about him, and spoke softly, her name on his lips, carrying a weight that made her shiver. "We can't keep dancing around it." Her heart pounded a wild rhythm that echoed in her ears as she looked up at him, her green eyes matching his hazel ones. His gaze was unwavering, filled with quiet determination and something deeper that made her breath hitch. "This is complicated," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. "You understand that." John said it in a gentle but firm tone, "but that doesn't make it any less true." And opened her mouth to argue and push him away, but the words would not come. He reached out, and his hand brushed lightly against her arm. The touch was barely there, a whisper of contact, but it sent shivers through her that she couldn't shake. "You feel it too," he said, his voice low and steady. It wasn't a question, it was a quiet, unmistakable truth. Anne's breath caught, and her chest tightened as she tried to find her footing in the moment. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the intensity in his eyes and the quiet confidence in his voice left her defenseless. "John," she began, her voice barely audible, but before she could continue, he stepped closer, his hand slipping from her arm to gently cup her cheek. "Just tell me one thing," he said, his voice softening and almost pleading. "Do you want this?" Her chest ached from the weight of his question and the raw vulnerability in his eyes. She felt as if she was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her feet, but there was no fear in his eyes, only patience, which made her want to leap. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not sure how to want something without being afraid of losing it." John brushed his thumb lightly against her cheek, saying, "You don't have to be afraid." Anne's resolve crumbled. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She reached up, her fingers curling lightly around his wrist. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice breaking, but I don't want to run anymore. That's all I needed to hear. John said softly as he leaned in, his forehead resting lightly against hers. The moment hung suspended, the world around them fading into nothing, and closed her eyes, her breath mingling with his.